Hello everyone, is everything working? Is the live stream going ahead? Um, Let me see. Are we live? Are we live? Um, let's see. Oh, we are. Excellent. Okay. Um, am I audible? Okay, perfect. It would seem that I am. Well, everybody, welcome to this presentation on 170 years of railway development in Sydney. On September the 26th of 1855, New South Wales saw its first train run from Sydney to Parramatta Junction. Since then, the network has grown to 168 different Sydney train stations and 247 when you include Metro and Light Rail. It's now an impressive feat of engineering, but how did it all begin? In part 1 of this live stream, we'll cover the 1850s to the 1910s, and in part 2, we'll cover the 1920s to the 2020s. Exactly 199 years and 364 days ago from the date of this presentation, the Stockton and Darlington Railway in England saw its first service. It's recognised as the first steam-operated public railway, built to haul coal, but carrying passengers from the start. Designed by George Stephenson, it proved rail's potential and sparked a boom across Britain and the Empire. Just 16 years later, Sydney opened its first line, showing how quickly rail spread worldwide. The 1850s, the very first decade where railways were present in New South Wales, saw the opening and expansion of a line that, by the end of the decade, stretched from Darling Harbour to Campbelltown. The first section of railway, which opened in 1855, comprised what is today known as the Main Suburban Line and travelled the 21 kilometres from Central to Parramatta Junction. The idea of railways in the colony had first been mooted in 1846 during a public meeting, and the proposals of railways were initiated 3 years later, under the Sydney Railway Company. This was followed by a ceremony on the 3rd of July 1850, where the first sod was turned by the daughter of the governor. It occurred in Cleveland Paddock, which is today the site of Prince Alfred Park. The line's original engineer, Francis Shields, wanted to utilise broad gauge, but his successor, James Wallace, switched to standard gauge in 1853. This decision would later go on to completely mismatch each Australian state's rail network, with 3 different gauges in place, requiring a change of train at the Queensland and Victorian border until well into the 20th century. The construction of the line also faced the large expense of land acquisition for the line, and shortages in money, in workers, and in supplies. By the time the line was completed in 1855, the government had taken over the project. The day of the opening itself saw a number of festivities, and even the arrival of the Governor-General to the station warranted a 19-gun salute, and a further 21-gun salute when the train itself departed. In fact, the occasion itself was likely the largest gathering in the colony's history up to that point. Now, the line itself opened with 5 stations, at Central, Everley, which is now Redfern, then Newtown, Ashfield, Burwood, Homebush, and finally Parramatta Junction. The line was electrified in 1929, with suburban services operating on the southernmost 4 tracks and steam trains travelling beyond the suburbs on the remaining 2 tracks. The line saw infill stations in Macdonaldtown, Stanmore, Petersham, Lewisham and Summer Hill, as well as Croydon, which opened under the name 5 Dock. Strathfield and other infill opened as Redmire. Flemington and Rookwood were a further 2, the latter of which no longer exists, after being closed in 1967. Lidcombe, which was named both Haslam's Creek and Rookwood at different points in time, opened in 1858, and Auburn in 1877. Clybourne was a workers' platform that opened in 1951 and served the Auburn Rail Maintenance Centre. Clyde itself was named Rose Hill Junction and then Clyde Junction from its opening in 1882, despite not becoming a functioning junction until 6 years later. The terminus of the line at Parramatta Junction would end up becoming a junction of its own 5 years after opening, between the main Western Line and the main South Line. Sydney Station first opened in 1855 on a site known as Cleveland Paddock, sometimes referred to as Redfern due to its proximity to the suburb. The station consisted of a single 30-metre long wooden platform with a simple corrugated iron shed serving as the main building. In 1856, additional rail sheds and yards were added to support growing operations, but by the 1870s, the station was struggling to cope with increasing crowds. This early iteration of Sydney's central terminus would soon give way to larger developments as the city's railway network expanded. Often overlooked in Sydney's rail history is its freight network. The first dedicated line, the 1 kilometre long Darling Harbour goods line, opened in 1856, following an 1840s plan for a freight terminal. Branching off the main suburban line between Central and Everleigh, it originally reached the site of today's Convention light rail stop, passing under Railway Square's overbridge, the first structure built for Sydney's rail network. By 1869, Regent Street Station, called Mortuary until 1938, opened to serve funeral trains to Brookwood Cemetery. Other spurs included a siding to the Powerhouse Museum for moving exhibits and Darling Harbour Station from 1875 to 1996, near today's Chinese Garden of Friendship. The line past the museum closed in 1996 for the Inner West Light Rail, and the remaining section closed in 2005. Between 2012 and 2015, it was transformed into a pedestrian pathway known as the Goods Line. Within a year of the Granville Line's success, the government allocated £600,000 for new lines to Parramatta, Windsor, Penrith, and south to the cow pastures, today's Campbelltown. Surveyors had even reached Goulburn Mine Bay, planning extensions toward Melbourne. Construction of the first section to Liverpool began in November of 1855, contracted to W. Randall. The line opened as a single track in 1856, duplicated a year later, and cost roughly $34 million today. Despite a fatal derailment 2 days before opening, the Governor-General ceremonially opened it on August 18th of 1856, with services starting on September the 1st. The 14-kilometre line initially had Parramatta Junction, Fairfield and Liverpool stations. Infill stations at Marylands, Guildford, Canleyvale, Cabramatta and Warwick Farm in the 1870s to 1880s brought the total to 8, with Yonora added in 1927. The line was electrified in 1929. Sydney's Cumberland region, a major producer of wheat, corn, beef, and wool, was next for rail expansion to better connect Sydney and Campbelltown, where 10,000 people were already travelling by 1846. In 1856, while the Granville to Liverpool section was finishing, the Great Southern Railway extension to Campbelltown was announced. Station locations were delayed due to landowner demands. Construction, again contracted to Randall, faced financial and labour shortages from the gold rush, with local sleepers used, and started in May 1856. Land values near the line rose 250% before opening. The line opened with Campbelltown as the terminus, followed by Glenfield, Minto, originally Campbellfields, Ingleburn, Lamia, Macquarie Fields, Bunbury Junction and Cashoola. All remain today except Bunbury Junction, which served workers during duplication of the line. The line was electrified in 1968 and now forms part of the T2, T5 and T8. Interestingly enough, this period of time was actually when Governor William Denison made the suggestion that in order to save money, the college should make the somewhat backwards decision of using horse-drawn power instead of steam. This obviously didn't eventuate, but Denison did actually put up quite a campaign for the idea. Now, at the end of the 1850s, here's what the network looked like. With just 10 stations between Campbelltown and Sydney and a short freight branch to Darling Harbour, there's a lot less than the massive 31 stations along that route today. There's been a few name changes too. Everleigh and Haslam's Creek stand out the most, and they're today's Redfern and Lidcombe. But to get a real idea about the network's first growth, we need to look west. The 1860s was a time of branching out for the rail network, quite literally. Branches to Rookwood, Richmond, and the Blue Mountains were all added, and extensions throughout the decade led to the main South Line reaching all the way to Goulburn. In July of 1860, Sydney's first branch line outside of Darling Harbour opened from Parramatta to Blacktown Road. Before the railway, travel between Parramatta and Sydney relied on ferry, road, or walking to Granville Station. Parramatta, settled in 1788, was already a major centre. The line, designed by John Whidden, opened with stations at Parramatta, Blacktown Road, renamed Blacktown in 1862, and a modified Parramatta Junction. The railway spurred local development, including a post office in 1862 and a school in 1877, while Granville itself became a functioning junction. Infill stations soon followed at Parramatta Park in 1861 and closed in 1914, Seven Hills in 1863, Toongabbie in 1880, Westmead in 1883, T.R. Smith's platform also in 1883, renamed Wentworthville in 1885, Harris Park and Pendle Hill in 1924. The line was fully electrified to Parramatta in 1929 and completed by 1955. A major derailment at Wentworthville in 1989 involved the first three carriages of a brand new Tangara train, the fleet's first serious accident. Today, though, the line serves the T1, the T2, the T5, and intercity services to the Blue Mountains. December the 3rd of 1861 was when the main Western Line was extended the 6-kilometre distance to Rooty Hill in Sydney's west. It opened with just one new station at the terminus in an area that at the time was mostly just farms for wheat and corn and grazing land. It had a low population at the time of opening, and as such, the line was a key part of opening up the Cumberland Plain for settlements. Not only did the line boost the amount of produce transported by rail, it also raised land values and encouraged subdivisions in the area. But given the low population at opening, the line only opened with very basic facilities, which limited passenger usage. An infill station at Doonside eventually opened in 1880 and was renamed Walkara for less than a fortnight during 1921. The post office, however, kept the name for 8 years longer. The line was electrified in 1955, nearly a century after its opening. The main Western Line was far from ending its expansions in suburban Sydney, however, as in 1862 the line reached St Mary's. St Mary's was known as South Creek at the time, not being renamed until 1885. At the time of opening, St Mary's, or South Creek, was just a small farming settlement, producing crops like wheat, corn, and grazing livestock. The railway's arrival to the area meant that farmers could have faster, cheaper transport to the City of Sydney's markets in comparison to horse and cart, and other transport. Like the previous extension of the line, land sales and subdivisions attracted new settlers to the area and cemented St Mary's as a local hub on the route to Penrith and the Blue Mountains. Mount Druitt opened as an infill station in 1881, and the line was electrified from 1955, along with the previous section from Blacktown. On the 1st of September 1862, the main South Line was extended 9 kilometres to Riversford on the north bank of the Nepean. Two stations were open at the time, Campbelltown, dating from 1858, and Riversford, which closed the following year once the line pushed further south. New stops soon followed. North Menangle opened in 1873 as Menangle Platform, operating until 1937. Glenlee opened in 1884, closing in 1947 after decades of serving the small district, and later became the site of a serious collision between the Melbourne Express and a coal train. Racecourse crowds were served from 1914 by Menangle Racecourse Station, located on a short stub, until it was replaced by Menangle Park in 1937. The extension to Macarthur in 1985 created Sydney's southern rail terminus, and electrification to that point the same year cemented the line's suburban role. Today, the corridor carries the T8 Airport to South Line and the Southern Highlands Line. On the 19th of January 1863, the main Western Line was extended 8 kilometres from St Mary's to Penrith, pushing the railway closer to the Blue Mountains. At the time, the landscape was mostly farmland, with only early development around Penrith, which would later grow into a major regional centre thanks to the railway. Along the route, Warrington opened in 1868 as Parkes Platform, named after the politician Henry Parkes and his adjoining estate. The name was changed in 1893 as the area's local identity grew. Kingswood followed in 1887 as Crossroads platform, serving a rural junction before being renamed the next year in honor of Governor Philip Gidley King. The section was electrified in 1955 and today carries both the T1 Western Line and the Blue Mountains Line trains, continuing its long role as the key gateway between Sydney and the mountains. On the 22nd of October 1864, a short 1 kilometre branch opened from Lidcombe to serve Rookwood Cemetery. Known as the Rookwood Cemetery Line, it carried funeral processions to the burial grounds for more than 80 years until its closure in 1948. Funeral trains to the line departed from Sydney's Mortuary Station, near Central, a matching sandstone building also designed by government architect James Barnett. Together, the two stations created a symbolic link between the city and its largest cemetery. At the heart of the branch was Cemetery Station Number 1, first called Haslam's Creek Cemetery and later renamed several times before settling on Mortuary General Cemetery in 1908. Designed by government architect James Barnett, the sandstone station was very ornate, with wide platforms, ticket offices, vestibules, retiring rooms, and a carriage port. Its walls were decorated with angels, cherubs, gargoyles, and intricate foliage carvings, while a bell tower rang at 30 minutes and 5 minutes before each funeral train's departure. The large arch structure of the station actually created a tunnel effect over the tracks, and after the line's closure, the station was dismantled and re-erected in Canberra in 1958 as All Saints Church, albeit with some alterations. Decades later, in 2000, restoration work at Rookwood revealed the old foundations and pathways of the site, preserving a link to this interesting chapter of Sydney's railway history. On the 1st of December 1864, the Richmond Line opened, branching from the main Western Line at Blacktown and running 26 kilometres northwest to Richmond. 5 stations were in use at the time: Riverstone, Mulgrave, Windsor, Clarendon, and Richmond. The line quickly became vital for the Hawkesbury district, serving both farming communities and the growing township of Windsor. Additional stops came later, including Schofields in 1870, Quakers Hill in 1872, and East Richmond in 1939, while smaller platforms like Mulgrave Tank 1887 to 1891 briefly dotted the route. Marryong joined the line in 1922, and Vineyard followed in 1935, as Sydney's suburbs pushed further outward. Originally single track, the line gained double track to Schofields, but remained largely single beyond, with passing loops at Riverstone, Mulgrave, and Clarendon. Electrification reached Riverstone in 1975 and was extended to Richmond in 1991. Today, the Richmond line is operated as part of the T1 T5 services, linking Sydney's fast-growing northwest suburbs. Despite this, it still holds the distinction of hosting some of Sydney's least used stations. A map fragment dated 1865, currently displayed on Platform 1 at Parramatta Station, offers a rare glimpse of Sydney's early railway network. Photographed in August of 2025, the fragment shows only the section west of Newtown, revealing details of a network still in development. Notably, the map marks both Penrith Temporary Station and Parramatta Temporary Station, reflecting the provisional nature of some early stops. Large gaps between stations south and west of Parramatta highlight the sparse coverage in outer areas at the time. Also featured is the Long Cove Viaduct, which today is the site of the Inner West Light Rail, crossing between Lewisham and Summer Hill, locations that did not exist when the map was drawn. The fragment provides a tangible connection to Sydney's railway beginnings, showing how the city's transport landscape has evolved over more than 150 years. July 11th of 1867 saw the opening of the world's first ever zigzag railway line through the Blue Mountains from Penrith to Wasco's Siding, today known as Blaxland. The line opened with 3 stations: the existing Penrith station, a station at Glenbrook, and finally the terminus at Blaxland. The first alignment stopped at the short-lived Log Cabin station, then crossed the Nepean River, making a stop at Emu Plains. It then reached a turnback point, where the train switched ends and continued along a different track further up the mountainside. This was repeated a second time before the line continued as normal. The original alignment travelled across Knapsack Creek on a sandstone viaduct, before making stops at Lucasville and Breakfast Point, then on to Glenbrook and Blaxland. The second alignment, opened in 1893, removed the zigzag segment of the line, instead using a tunnel to run direct from Emu Plains to Glenbrook. The line was then deviated a third time via Glenbrook Gorge, branching off just past Emu Plain Station and stopping at the new Glenbrook Station, with an infill at Lapston opening in 1964. Indeed, during construction of the third deviation, a freight tramway was constructed from the old tunnel alignment to the new 1913 route to move materials to and from the new line. The line was electrified in 1957. It's the end of the 1860s, and the network looks like this. There's now 3 distinct branches present, and lines extend past the metropolitan area all the way to Goulburn and Lithgow. There's only 15 stops between Central Station and Richmond, less than half of today's 34, but with aspirations for lines to the state's regions, the 1870s will be a quiet decade for the network. There was not a single railway line in metropolitan Sydney that opened between 1870 and 1879, but infill stations and a revamped Central Station were in store for the decade. The second Sydney station opened in 1874 and, like its predecessor, was sometimes unofficially called Redfern. Designed by John Whidden, who later became famous for building the zigzag railway in the Blue Mountains, the new station initially featured just 2 platforms. As Sydney's railway network and passenger numbers grew, the station expanded rapidly, reaching 14 platforms by the early 1900s. By 1899, it was handling an astonishing 25 million passenger visits, highlighting the city's explosive growth and the station's rising importance as a transport hub. Between the end of the 1860s and the end of the 1870s, 15 infill stations opened. The regional network reached Wagga Wagga and Orange, and the main line between Central and Parramatta looks quite similar to the line as it is today. But don't let the quietness of the 1870s fool you, as the 1880s has 11 different lines opening, creating lines from the northern suburbs and the southern suburbs of Sydney for the first time. On the 10th of March 1882, the Camden Line opened, branching 13 kilometres from Campbelltown to Camden. Nicknamed the Camden Tram or Pansy, the line was originally built as a light railway before later being upgraded to full standard. At opening, stations included Kenny Hill, Currans Hill, Narellan, Graham's Hill, Kirkham and Camden, with Campbelltown already in use since 1870. The line quickly became known for its steep 1 in 19 grade at Kenny Hill, where trains often stalled and passengers sometimes had to walk alongside before reboarding. It carried a mix of passengers, coal from Narellan and milk from Camden's dairy farmers' siding. Special Good Friday services ran annually to Maryfield's Monastery, requiring extra locomotives to handle the crowds. Despite its quirks, the line served the district for more than 80 years, before closing on the 1st of January 1963 due to low patronage and operational difficulties. Remnants of the corridor's alignment can still be found in Narellan and the infamous Kenny Hill, reminders of this unique branch line. In 1883, the Thornley Zigzag opened, a short 1 kilometre branch built to serve a local quarry, supplying ballast for the main North Line. It was the third zigzag constructed in New South Wales, and notably the first outside the Blue Mountains. The line dropped about 30 metres over just 1.2 kilometres, and while it primarily supported construction of the main North, it actually opened before the main line itself. By 1892, the zigzag was no longer needed and was closed. Today, much of the alignment has been built over with housing, though Zigzag Creek, which runs alongside part of the old route, preserves the name of Sydney's small suburban zigzag railway. On the 15th of October 1884, the South Coast Line opened, running 14 kilometres from Redfern through Sydney's southern suburbs to Hurstville. 9 stations were in use at the time, including Erskineville, St Peters, Sydenham, Tempe, Ardcliffe, Rockdale, Kogarah and Hurstville. The route was built to open up Sydney's southern districts and form the beginning of the Illawarra line to the south coast. At first, many stations were surrounded by farmland and market gardens, but suburban housing soon followed as the line spurred growth. A major obstacle was crossing the Cooks River, which was initially achieved with a timber bridge. Early congestion near the city meant the line was quickly expanded to 4 tracks to handle the mix of suburban, intercity and freight trains. Infill stations soon began to appear. Carlton opened in 1889, Banksia in 1906 and Alloa in 1925, each serving growing residential areas. However, the South Coast Line was far from finishing its expansion, with a 10-kilometre line to Sutherland opening on Boxing Day of 1885. It opened with just 2 new stations at Como and Sutherland, with the crossing of the Georges River at Como. The original Como Bridge was a major engineering achievement, and today the old bridge parallels a more recently constructed one as a pedestrian bridge. In fact, Como Station had to be moved 1 kilometre south in 1972 when the new Como Bridge opened to make room for it. The first two new stations were followed a year later by Penshurst and Oatley, and Como wasn't the only station to be moved, as Oatley had to be shifted onto a new alignment in 1905 to make the track grade easier to handle. Now, the new stations encouraged suburban growth, with Oatley and Como in particular becoming a riverside picnic destination. The section carried commuters, freight, long distance, and even weekend visitors heading for river and bushland recreation areas. A later station opened at Mortdale in 1897. The 1920s and 1930s brought around more action for the line, with Mortdale Maintenance Centre, the main depot south of the city, opening in 1925 for the new electric train fleet. This was shortly followed by the state's first electric train journey in 1926, of which Oatley Station was the first stop. And less than 3 months later, on March 9th of 1886, not one but two extensions of the South Coast Line opened on the same day. The first of these was through the national parks of the Illawarra Waterfall, 14 kilometres away. It opened with stations at Sutherland, Loftus Junction, Heathcote and Waterfall, which was known as Waterfalls for less than a year. Engadine, the line's only infill, opened in 1920. The line was demanding for steam locomotives when it opened as a result of its steepness and its tight curbs, but the steam and diesel locomotives were replaced by electric trains as far as Loftus in 1926, and the remainder of the line in 1980. Today, Waterfall is the southern terminus of the T4, and the line through the demanding train further south is part of the Intercity South Coast Line. Tragically, in 2003, Waterfall was the site of the Waterfall rail accident, where a train south of the station derailed, following the driver suffering a heart attack. On a lighter note, if you remember me mentioning a second branch opening on the same day, you'd be correct. The Royal National Park branch left the south coastline at Loftus Junction before travelling 2 kilometres through the bush to the Royal National Park station. The station was renamed a number of times throughout its history, starting as Loftus, then becoming National Park, then becoming Loftus again, then becoming National Park again, then becoming the National Park, and finally becoming the Royal National Park, when Queen Elizabeth renamed the park on a visit in the 1950s. The first station on the site was used by the military, as well as visitors to the national park and residents of the nearby Grays Point. The line was electrified in 1926, and by the 1930s saw 25 passenger services each weekend. In 1946, the Australian Scout Jamboree was held in the area, and a platform called Scout Platform was opened to serve it, afterwards being used as a stabling loop for trains. When the park celebrated its centenary, a new station opened to replace the old one, and by the mid-1980s, there were just 7 trains each week, with the line being used to test trains on it. A signal fault occurred in 1991, and by this point, there were not enough passengers to warrant fixing it, causing the line's closure shortly after. Today, though, the line has been taken over by the Sydney Tramway Museum, who operate services on it. For now, though, it's time to look at the main North Line, which opened on September 17th of 1886. The 22-kilometre line opened with 9 stations at Strathfield, Rhodes, Ryde, Dundas, Field of Mars, Beecroft, Pennant Hills, and Thornley and Hornsby. You probably don't recognise some of these names, because before the Carlingford line's opening in the 1890s, Eastwood and Epping were able to use the names Dundas and Carlingford. As far as for West Ryde, it was renamed in 1945. The line crossed the Parramatta River on a bridge designed by railway engineer John Whidden, which was replaced in 1980 and was converted for pedestrian use in 2000. Concord and Meadowbank opened in 1887, with the former being renamed Concord West in 1909 and the latter renamed Meadowbank without a space in 1927. Normanhurst opened in 1895 and was temporarily renamed Hornsby for 3 years as Hornsby itself became Hornsby Junction. Cheltenham opened in 1898, followed by North Strathfield in 1918. In 1929, the line was electrified, and in 1937, Denniston Station opened as the last infill on the line. In 2009, the Epping to Chatswood rail link opened, and new platforms were constructed underground at Epping, with junctions north of the station. These junctions were made redundant in 2019, though, with the opening of the Sydney Metro. The line has 4 tracks from North Strathfield to Rhodes, before crossing the Parramatta River on just 2 tracks, returning to 4 tracks from West Ryde to Eastwood and maintaining 3 tracks for the remainder of the line. A year after the line to Horsby opened, it was extended on April 7th of 1887 on the 23-kilometre route to Hawkesbury River. It opened with just two new stations, Barara and Hawkesbury River, and was the second last section of line needed to facilitate the direct connection from Sydney to Brisbane. Hawkesbury River actually opened as Pete's Ferry and was renamed to Brooklyn in 1888, then Hawkesbury River in 1889, then Hawkesbury in 1890, and back to Hawkesbury River in 1906. In August, less than half a year after the line's opening, a station at River Wharf opened to connect with a paddle steam ferry named General Gordon to either Woy Woy or Mullet Creek stations on the line from Newcastle. Also in 1887, in July, Kohler Station opened, later renamed Mount Kohler in 1906. In 1889, the Hawkesbury River Bridge opened, closing River Wharf and the ferry service as a result. Cowan Station opened in 1890 and was followed by Ku-ring-gai Station in 1901, which was renamed Mount Ku-ring-gai in 1904. Finally, the 1915 opening of Asquith Station was the last change until the present day. The line was electrified to Cowan in 1959 and to the remainder of the line a year later, with Cowan historically being used as the suburban rail terminus until January of 1992, when they were curtailed to Barara. In 1990, an intercity train tragically collided with Steam Train 3801 between Cowan and Hawkesbury River as a result of a signal failure. Turning the focus south, though, on October 3rd of 1888, a line through the Illawarra to Coalcliff was opened. The line opened on an alignment with 7 tunnels, those being Waterfall, Corley, Helensburgh, Metropolitan, Lilyvale 1 and 2, and Otford. Waterfall Tunnel was later opened up and turned into a cutting when the track was duplicated. The extension opened with stations at Corley Siding, which would go on to close in the 1900s, at Lilyvale, which closed in 1983, at Otford, and at Coalcliff. Corley was a now completely removed workers' town and was once home to hundreds of residents. After the construction of the line and its deviations, however, it dwindled in population, effectively becoming a ghost town by the turn of the century. Helensburgh Station opened a year after the rest of the line in 1889, and Stanwell Park opened in 1901. This all changed in 1920 though, as a new deviation was opened with far more bends in order to make it easier for steam trains to climb up the Illawarra Escarpment. This has since been made redundant, as electric trains no longer need this ease of climbing and could have very easily used the old alignment if it was still in operation. Nonetheless, the new alignment opened with a replacement station at Helensburgh, and new tunnels at Helensburgh, Metropolitan Colliery, and Lilyvale. In fact, the old Helensburgh station and tunnels are today a hotspot for glowworms, a tourist attraction for the area. In 1920, another deviation opened, this time on the southern portion of the line, and was built to bypass the Otford Tunnel, which was infamous for its suffocating conditions as a result of the tunnel gradient and thick smog that would flood the tunnel. Tunnels at Bald Hill, Stanwell Park, and Stanwell Creek opened, alongside new stations at Stanwell Park and Coalcliff. The line was electrified in 1985 via the 1950 and 1920 deviations. 1888 saw the opening of the Sandown Line, a 4-kilometre branch leaving the main suburban line at Clyde. It opened with just 2 stations, the existing junction of Clyde and the new station of Rose Hill, serving the adjacent racecourse. This line was known as Bennett's Railway as a result of the name of its private owner, and saw both passenger and freight services. Passenger services, however, didn't go beyond Rose Hill until 1892, with the opening of Sandown Station, which would go on to close in 1991. It was followed by Cream of Tartar Works platform in 1927, which served, you guessed it, a cream of tartar factory. The platform later closed in 1959. Goodyear Station opened in 1934 and closed before 1991, and it was around this time that the line was electrified to Rose Hill, 1936 to be exact. Hardy's was the final new station on the line, opening in 1938 and closing in 1991. The line was electrified in 1959 to Sandown, but eventually saw passenger services cease to operate, and de-electrification occurred in 2002. Finally, the line officially closed in 2019 past Rose Hill, and Rose Hill itself saw the demise a year later. Today though, Rose Hill sees itself as the site of a future Sydney Metro depot, and the line is set for reuse as part of the L5 Olympic Park light rail line, projected to open in 2031. The Warwick Farm Racecourse branch was next to open on the 12th of June 1889. It was a 2-kilometre long branch and had just one station, at the racecourse. The station had a long platform, extended even further by a 200-metre long horse stock platform, and had further stabling for the 8 different trains, with the platform able to with the platform itself able to hold 2 trains. The line was electrified in 1926 but went out of use in 1977, being revitalised in 1979. The line was operated by the Australian Jockey Club but saw its last train in 1990 and closed in 1991 as the Jockey Club could no longer fund its maintenance. At the very end of 1889, the network had lines south to the Illawarra and Royal National Park, southwest all the way to Melbourne and Camden, west as far as Burke and Richmond, and north all the way to Brisbane. The next decade, however, was going to expand the range of suburban lines even further. The 1890s brought about the North Shore Line, the Bankstown Line as far as Belmore, and finished off the Carlingford Line. However, there were also expansions in the form of the Rookwood Line and even a munitions railway around Newington Armoury. The North Shore Line first opened as a 25-kilometre suburban line on New Year's Day of 1890. It branched off from Hornsby, which for a time was known as Hornsby Junction, before stopping at Pierce's Corner, later renamed Warunga, Eastern Road, renamed to Turramurra, at Pymble, Gordon, Linfield, Rossville, later renamed Roseville, at Chatswood, and at St Leonard's. The line had quite the history behind it, with a petition first started in 1874 for a line to the region, from Warunga to Sydney Harbour. A committee formed a year later, but the Public Works Department held strong opposition to the idea, calling it a railway from nowhere to nowhere. Surveyors proved the line's feasibility in 1879, but then the Garden Palace fire in the Botanic Gardens effectively destroyed all the remnants of the survey. Sir Henry Parkes was a strong supporter of the line and of the future Sydney Harbour Bridge, as the line was to run through his electorate of St Leonard's. Another proposal following the survey record's destroyal suggested a line terminating at Falcon Street in Crow's Nest. The contractors for the Crow's Nest line later withdrew, however, and new contractors changed the destination to St Leonard's, which was the terminus of the line after its construction was finished in May of 1889. It officially opened the following year as a single-track line. 3 infill stations opened, one at Waitara in 1895, one at Artarmon in 1898, and one at Killara in 1899. The line was electrified in 1927. The development of the North Shore Line was not over, however, as on May the 1st of 1893, a 4-kilometre extension opened to Milson's Point, beside Sydney Harbour. The line opened with stations at Edwards Road, renamed to Wollstonecraft in 1900, at Bay Road, named Waverton in 1929, and finally at Milson's Point, where it met with connecting ferries to the city, and trams to North Sydney's CBD, along Miller Street. The eventual construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge saw the gradual demise of the line, with its construction works meaning Milson's Point station had to be shifted backwards. The result of this move away from the waterfront meant that Australia's first ever lifts and escalators had to be installed, linking the trams, the trains, and the ferries. After the bridge opened, the line past Waverton was converted to the North Sydney car sidings, used to stable trains, and the occasional rail tour provides passengers with the harbour views from the line. This could all end, however, as there have been recent proposals for a Highline walkway along the viaduct and around Lavender Bay, giving more people the opportunity to experience the views from the line on foot. On the 1st of February in 1895, the Bankstown line opened on an 8-kilometre line to Belmore. It had 7 stations, starting with Sydenham at the junction with the South Coast Line, followed by Marrickville, Wardell Road, Fernhill, Canterbury, Campsie and Belmore, with Wardell Road becoming Dulwich Hill in 1920 and Fernhill becoming Helston Park in 1911. The line was built to relieve pressure on the Old Main South Line and encourage suburban development, but its construction was slowed by the 1890s Depression. It runs west along the Cooks River Valley, parallel to the Metropolitan Goods Line, and crosses to the southern side of the Cooks River at Canterbury, then continuing on to Campsie. The line was electrified in 1926 and is currently closed, as it's being converted as part of the Sydney Metro, which will use the line from 2026. The Carlingford line was extended on April 20th of 1896 and was a 5-kilometre rail line in suburban Parramatta. The line closed in 2020 and was converted to what is today the Parramatta Light Rail. The line ran northeast from Rosehill to Carlingford, featuring single platforms and no passing loops. It opened with 5 stations: Rosehill, Subiaco, Victoria Road, Kissing Point Road, and Pennant Hills. Pennant Hills was renamed to Carlingford, Kissing Point Road was renamed to Dundas, Victoria Road was renamed to Bradlemere and Subiaco became Camellia, after these were renamed in 1901, following changes made by the state government. Camellia was actually Sydney's least used station while it was open, with just 140 total entries and exits each day. The line was initially privately owned by the Rose Hill Railway Company and was purchased by the government in 1898. Past Rose Hill, no signals existed and only one block section existed, which allowed only one train at a time on the line. Talopia Station opened as an infill in 1925, the line was electrified in 1959, and the original bridge over the Parramatta River was replaced in 1996. Low patronage on the line and the busy Parramatta Road level crossing led to inquiries into the Carlingford line's long-term future. A rail link between Parramatta, Epping and Chatswood planned for duplication of the line, as well as underground stations, and an extension to the North Shore line via Epping. Only stage 1 of the rail link from Chatswood to Epping was ever built, with the remainder cancelled. The Rail Clearways project of 2004 proposed a loop at Rydalmere to allow half-hourly trains to operate, but this was cancelled in 2008. Ultimately, the line was closed in 2020 to allow for the construction of the Parramatta Light Rail on the route. The Rookwood Cemetery line saw an extension on May the 26th of 1897 on a 1 kilometre line to Cemetery Station Number 3. The extension began at Station Number 1, which at that point was named Mortuary General Cemetery, and the waiting room of Station 1 had to be removed to allow for the line to be extended out through the other side of the station. Station Number 2, which opened as the Roman Catholic platform, was an infill and opened in 1901, with a curved platform shape and a small wooden shelter on the platform. Finally, there was Station Number 3, which had a straight platform and reused the waiting room that was removed from Station 1. The line eventually closed in 1948. Newington Armoury, in the northern portion of Sydney Olympic Park, is a heritage site that was once the Royal Australian Navy's armament depot. The site is home to a 5 kilometre, 2-foot gauge railway that was used for transporting weapons, ammunition, and equipment. When Olympic Park was being developed in the 1990s, the railway was turned into a passenger heritage train, which opened in 1991. Disappointingly though, the line has been temporarily suspended since 2019 for passengers, with the most recent documented non-passenger test runs having occurred back in 2024. Nonetheless, the tracks are still visible from many footpaths throughout the park. At the very end of 1899, the network had lines reaching the North Shore, as well as to Hornsby, Belmore, the Illawarra, Rookwood, Carlingford, Camden, and regional destinations in practically every destination, but there was still much more to be built. The 1900s brought an expansion to the cemetery rail network, with a line to Warrenor Cemetery and to Rookwood Station Number 4. The first of Sydney's twin quarry railways opened to Prospect, and the Bankstown line finally reached its namesake. Starting off the 20th century, the Darling Harbour line was extended to Darling Island on January 22nd, 1 kilometre away from the terminus of over 40 years at Darling Harbour Yard. Darling Island was in essence an extension of the Darling Harbour Yard itself, and because of the extension, ships were able to load and unload without having to enter into Darling Harbour. The yard was eventually demolished between 1985 and 1988 to make way for the Darling Harbour development, and the line was turned into an underground light rail which opened in 1997. Accompanying Rookwood as Sydney's only other cemetery railway, the Warrenor line opened on June 30th of 1900. The 1 kilometre line branched off the south coastline south of Sutherland and curved northeast into Warrenor Cemetery. The cemetery site was originally a brickworks and was very nearly converted to a racecourse, but the cemetery itself went ahead, opening in 1895. The line's trains carried both coffins and mourners, and the original platform is now the site of some of the cemetery's offices. The station itself had a 134-metre long platform and a wooden building, but was demolished after its closure. The railway was never electrified and was served by a CPH rail motor train. Alas, the rise of motorcars saw the decline of funeral trains, and the line was closed in 1947. On April the 7th of 1902, the 5 kilometre railway to Prospect Quarry in Western Sydney opened. It was a privately owned line that branched off the main Western line at Toongabbie and had 3 locations along its route: Toongabbie Siding, Prospect Halt and Prospect Quarry. Passengers were able to ride as far as Prospect Halt Station, with a line beyond there being dedicated for freight movements. The line was used mainly to transport gravel from the quarry and was operated by a steam locomotive nicknamed the Possum. A second line from Fairfield to Widemere Quarry, just 2 kilometres away, opened 23 years later, and despite the potential for a Parramatta bypass railway that could have been formed between the two lines, they were never connected. The line eventually closed in 1945. The third Sydney station, now known as Central, opened in 1906 and opened with 15 platforms, and its structure was built with a steel frame and concrete. The station today has a whopping 26 platforms, as well as 2 unused underground platforms. It is a clock tower that was built in 1915, and in 1916, the station was the site of the Battle of Central Station, where soldiers rebelled against camp conditions, commandeered trains, and started destroying station facilities. Suburban platforms 16 to 23 were built in 1926, and 4 underground platforms, 24, 25, 26, and 27, were built in 1979, although 2 of them were left abandoned and unopened. Since then, 2 Sydney Metro platforms have taken numbers 26 and 27, and as a result of the Sydney Metro construction, platform 15 was removed without a replacement. Looking back at Rookwood, a final 1 kilometre extension to Cemetery Station 4 opened on the 19th of June 1908. It served the Jewish area of the Rookwood Cemetery and was located outside the Anglican and general offices of the cemetery. The platform was 160 metres long. It was only 900 metres as the crow flies from Station 4 back to Station 1, and yet a loop between the 2 stations never eventuated. The line eventually closed in 1948, with no further extensions to the Rookwood line ever taking place. April the 14th of 1909 saw the Bankstown line finally reach its namesake station of Bankstown. The 5 kilometre extension left Belmore with stops at Lakemba, Punchbowl, and finally Bankstown. It was electrified in 1926 and was home to the Punchbowl Depot, which was purpose-built for the new electric train fleet. The depot was later demolished to make way for housing. The line had just one infill at Wiley Park, which opened in 1938. Bankstown today has actually been rebuilt as a dual train and metro station, as the line from Sydenham to Bankstown is shut for conversion to the Sydney Metro. Between 2002 and 2006, the line was heavily upgraded, with new concrete sleepers, new signalling, and more. The plan for conversion to Sydney Metro was greenlit in 2018, with short-term weekend closures beginning in 2019. The project's opening was delayed to 2025 and now 2026, since the line has been shut since the end of September 2024. By the end of 1909, the map has got a lot more branches than ever before. To Camden, Warwick Farm, Prospect, Richmond, Carlingford, Sandown, Rookwood, and plenty more. The 1910s are said to be a very freight-oriented decade though. The 1910s saw the construction of lines to the abattoirs at what is now Olympic Park, to Potts Hill Water Reservoir, a freight link through Chullora, a line to Rozelle, and even a line through the Anzac Rifle Range at Halsworthy. The first line to open in the decade was the Abattoirs line, on July 31st of 1911. The line was a 4-kilometre route from a 3-way junction with the main suburban line near Flemington to the industrial areas of Homebush Bay in today's Sydney Olympic Park. The line had 4 stations total, with the Metropolitan meat platforms opening in 1915. Stations at Saleyards and Thorpes opened at a later point, with Pippita Station opening in 1940 and closing in 1995, serving the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory in the area. Sidings on the line served both dairy farmers and Ford, and passenger services were operated using Rail Motors, Red Rattlers, and V-sets. The line closed past Pippita in 1990, then the remainder in 1996. It reopened as far as Pippita's former location in 1998 to form a portion of today's Sydney Olympic Park line, and in 2022 was proposed to be converted to a rail trail, which would reuse disused bridges and run parallel to the Olympic Park line, boosting active transport. On November 11th of 1912, the Potts Hill and Regent's Park lines opened. The 5-kilometre total route had 2 stations at opening, Barella and Regent's Park. The line left the main suburban line at Lidcombe and continued to Potts Hill Pumping Station, the location of a water reservoir that continues to serve the Sydney region. The line to Potts Hill was a short branch and was operated by the Metropolitan Water, Sewerage and Drainage Board. The line also carried passenger trains and workers' trains for people working at the pump station. The line to the water reservoir left the Regent's Park route just north of the station, before running southeast to the pump station. The line followed the water pipes, crossed over the Enfield goods lines, and ended in a loop at the pumping station. The line was funded by the Water Board to serve its works and provide settlement in the Potts Hill area, and was completed in July of 1912. The line was later rebuilt to remove level crossings during works for the Regent's Park to Cabramatta extension, and the last train to Potts Hill ran in 1965, with the line closing officially in 1966. Interestingly enough, the Sydney Tramway Museum actually reused some of the rails from the branch line for the museum's trackage. Continuing on with the Potts Hill Line's history, a second 1 kilometre branch was opened at some point in 1916. It served the number 2 reservoir on a branch off the main reservoir line, and was used for both construction and maintenance purposes. It functioned alongside the main Potts Hill line and closed alongside it too, and not much physical evidence of the branch remains today. The shape of the suburban area of Potts Hill, however, does reflect the curves of the line from when it was in operation. The Campsie to Flemington goods line, which opened on April 11th of 1916, is a key part of Sydney's freight railway network. The line was built as part of Sydney's separate goods lines program after 1908 in order to relieve congestion on the Darling Harbour line. The line links the main suburban line with the Bankstown line, starting at Flemington Maintenance Depot and ending in the Campsie area. The line's main feature is the Enfield Marshalling Yard, which is Sydney's largest freight marshalling yard. The eastern side of the yard features the DELEC, or diesel-electric, locomotive facility, and the line provides access from northern and western New South Wales freight to the Botany line and the wider Sydney freight network. The line also links to the Chullora to Sefton line and is used for freight facility access, with passenger trains formerly diverted during occasional Inter-West line track work, although following the Bankstown line's conversion to Metro, this will never be seen again. In the 1990s, Enfield Yard was remodeled and freight was consolidated there, and workers' trains ran until 1996. The trains stopped at Enfield Loco, Enfield South, Hope Street and DELEC, the first two of which opened in 1924 and the final which opened in 1957. The line was electrified in the 1950s and 60s. The Rozelle goods line opened on May 29th of 1916 and was 8 kilometres long. It opened to serve the port of White Bay, branching off the Bankstown line at Dulwich Hill. It served Mungo Scott's flour mill, which ended up being one of the line's last uses before its closure, and had yards at both Rozelle and White Bay. A stop at the White Bay power station at the end of the line at Rozelle existed, and the line was strictly used by freight until its closure in 2009 and the replacement by the 2014 Sydney Light Rail extension to Dulwich Hill. It was electrified in the 1960s, and today the former Rozelle yards exist as the Rozelle Parklands, which has some informative signage, and there are remnants of the line today as far as White Bay Cruise Terminal. The Anzac Rifle Range line was a line built during World War I, opening on January the 21st of 1918. It was 8 kilometres long and had stations at Liverpool Camp, Anzac Rifle Range, Remount Depot and Halsworthy. The line crossed the Georges River at Liverpool on a bridge that used recycled parts from locations such as Mossvale and places on the main south and main western line. The line fell into disuse during the 1920s, following the end of World War I, and was closed past the rifle range, but it managed to be brought back from the brink as a result of World War II's occurrence. Alas, the line met its final closure in 1977, but about a decade after its closure, Halsworthy saw another railway line open, this time linking the East Hills line to the main south line, but with no connecting tracks to the disused and abandoned rifle range line. By the end of 1919, the freight lines had really started to dominate the map, especially the links from Bankstown line right up to Rozelle and the Abattoirs, and down to Potts Hill as well. Well, that brings us to the end of part 1. Coming up in part 2, I'll go over the projects involving the City Circle line and some of John Bradfield's ambitious proposals, and newer lines like the Sydney Light Rail and Sydney Metro. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.